Eleanor was doing something entirely ordinary when she found the transfer authorization slip hidden inside a dusty binding of the corporate tax archive. She did not scream. She did not cry. She simply placed the paper flat on the heavy mahogany desk, aligning its edges perfectly with the wood grain. Because by morning, she would understand that the family she had spent 15 years rebuilding her life to protect had been planning her destruction for months. The archive room of the Sterling Family Trust always smelled of lemon oil polish and dry, aging paper. It was a scent that Eleanor had learned to associate with safety. At 44, she was the quiet engine of the Sterling Empire. While her younger brother Julian gave the keynote speeches and graced the covers of business magazines, Eleanor managed the unglamorous, heavy machinery of their wealth. She ran the logistics division, the supply chains, the quiet, steady investments that kept the family insulated from failure. She was the one who checked the locks. She was the one who balanced the ledgers. She was the one who, 15 years ago, had taken the blame for a catastrophic regulatory oversight to save her father from federal prison. She had lost her reputation, her 20s, and her engagement over that scandal. She had rebuilt herself from the ashes, brick by brick, earning her way back into the inner circle. She believed, with the quiet certainty of someone who has paid their dues in blood, that she was finally safe. She picked up the transfer authorization slip again. It was printed on the heavy, cream-colored stock reserved for executive action. The date was 3 weeks old. The amount was staggering. $7.5 million. But it was not the amount that made the air in the archive room feel suddenly thin and cold. It was the destination account. A subsidiary holdings firm based in a jurisdiction with absolute banking secrecy. And at the bottom, bearing the undeniable, heavy stroke of a fountain pen, was her own signature. Eleanor stared at the blue ink. She had not signed this paper. She traced the curve of the E. It was a flawless forgery. The loop was slightly heavier on the downstroke, just as hers always was. Someone had practiced this. Someone who had access to the secure filing room. Someone who knew exactly how she held her pen. She folded the slip precisely in half and slid it into the inner pocket of her blazer. The fabric felt heavy against her chest. She turned off the brass reading lamp, leaving the archive room in the quiet gloom of a late Tuesday evening. The Sterling building was nearly empty. Her heels clicked rhythmically against the marble floors as she walked toward the executive elevators. She told herself there was a logical explanation, an administrative error, a contingency fund moved by the board that she had somehow forgotten signing. She pressed the elevator button. The brushed steel doors opened, reflecting a woman who looked calm, tailored, and entirely in control. But as the elevator descended, her right hand instinctively brushed against the pocket of her blazer. The next morning, the Sterling estate was covered in a thick gray frost. The family gathered for their weekly breakfast meeting in the solarium, a tradition her mother, Margaret, insisted upon. Margaret sat at the head of the glass table, pouring Earl Grey tea from a silver pot. She wore her usual cashmere cardigan, her silver hair perfectly arranged. Julian was opposite her, typing furiously on his phone, looking exhausted but manic, his designer suit slightly wrinkled. Eleanor took her seat. The smell of the bitter orange marmalade and hot toast usually grounded her. Today, it made her stomach turn. She watched them. She watched the way her mother handed Julian his teacup, the soft, protective look in her eyes. She watched Julian take it without saying thank you. She decided to test the water. Just a small drop to see the ripples. She picked up her spoon and stirred her tea. The silver clinked against the porcelain. "I was in the archives late last night," Eleanor said quietly, reviewing the quarterly allocations for the logistics arm. Julian's fingers stopped tapping his phone. It was a fraction of a second, A microscopic pause, but Eleanor saw it. "Oh?" Margaret said, her voice smooth and unbothered. She did not look up from the sugar bowl. "Find anything interesting, darling? You work too hard. The past is the past. We pay accountants to look at those dusty things." "Just routine," Eleanor said. "Though I noticed a slight discrepancy in the outflow to the offshore contingencies. A transfer I don't recall approving." Julian set his phone face down on the glass table. The thud was too loud. "Eleanor, you sign 100 documents a week," he said, offering a tight, patronizing smile. "You probably rubber-stamped it during the restructuring. Don't invent ghosts where there are none." "You're right," Eleanor said. She took a slow sip of her tea. "I must have forgotten." She had not forgotten, and they knew she had not forgotten. The silence that fell over the table was not the comfortable silence of family. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of people sharing a room with a bomb. By noon, Eleanor had bypassed the internal network. She used a burner laptop from a coffee shop 3 blocks away from the Sterling building to access the public registry of the offshore holding company. The layers of corporate obfuscation were dense, designed to exhaust anyone looking for a name. But Eleanor had designed half of the family's security protocols. She knew how the architecture of hidden money worked. It took her 3 hours of tracing IP registrations and cross-referencing shell company directors to find the anchor point. The shell company was leased to a private venture capital firm, a firm that Julian had secretly invested in 2 years ago. A firm that, according to the financial news sites she pulled up next, was currently facing massive insolvency and a quiet federal inquiry for defrauding its investors. Julian was drowning. He needed a lifeline, and he had taken $7.5 million from the family trust to plug the hole. But why forge her signature? As CEO, Julian had the authority to move capital. He would have to answer to the board eventually, but he could do it. Unless the money wasn't just being moved. Unless it was being stolen in a way that violated the core covenants of the trust. Eleanor closed the laptop. The coffee shop smelled of roasted beans and damp coats. The city outside was moving, people walking past the window, oblivious to the fact that her entire reality had just shifted on its axis. If the federal inquiry into Julian's venture firm found the stolen trust money, they would trace it back to the signature on the authorization slip. Her signature. They were not just covering a debt. They were building a firewall. And Eleanor was the brick they were using to build it. She needed to know who else was involved. She walked back to the Sterling building, the cold wind biting her cheeks. She went straight to the legal department on the 12th floor. The corridors here were hushed, carpeted in deep blue. She knocked on the door of Marcus Vance, the family's senior general counsel. Marcus had been with the family for 30 years. He had drafted the paperwork when Eleanor took the fall for her father. He had looked her in the eye back then and told her it was the only way to save the family. Marcus was at his desk, reading a brief. He looked up, surprised. "Eleanor, to what do I owe the pleasure?" She sat in the leather chair opposite him. She did not take off her coat. "I need to look at the master ledger for the Cayman subsidiaries, Marcus." Marcus took off his reading glasses. He placed them carefully on his desk. He did not ask why. He did not ask what she was looking for. He simply laced his fingers together and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. It was pity. "The ledger is currently under audit, Eleanor," Marcus said softly. "Julian ordered a lockdown of the executive files yesterday afternoon. Julian doesn't have the authority to lock me out of the logistics financials," Eleanor said, keeping her voice entirely level. "He does, actually," Marcus said. He opened a drawer and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He slid it across the desk. "The board held an emergency proxy vote this morning. Margaret cast the deciding ballot. They've temporarily suspended your executive access pending an internal review of some irregularities in your division. The room seemed to tilt. Eleanor looked at the paper. It was a formal suspension notice. Her mother had cast the deciding vote. They found the forged slip, Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a whisper. They planted it, and now they are pretending to discover it. Marcus did not confirm or deny it. He simply looked at his hands. Eleanor, I have served your family for a very long time. I know how the machine works. When the machine needs a part to break so the rest can keep running, it finds the part that has broken before. It's the path of least resistance. You know Julian is stealing from the trust to cover his venture losses, she said. I know nothing of the sort, Marcus said smoothly, but his eyes shifted just for a second toward the window. I know that a massive sum of money is missing. I know that federal regulators are asking questions, and I know that there is a paper trail leading directly to your office. You have a history, Eleanor. The narrative is already written. He was telling her it was over. He was telling her to accept the slaughter quietly. Eleanor stood up. She did not take the suspension notice. She left it on the desk. Thank you for your time, Marcus. Eleanor, he called out as she reached the door. She paused, not turning around. Hire independent counsel. Today. Do not speak to anyone in this building. She walked out of the office. The blue carpets suddenly looked like deep water. She was drowning, and the people holding her head under were the ones who had taught her how to swim. She did not go back to her office. She left the building and walked for a long time. The city was a maze of concrete and glass, indifferent to her ruin. She thought about 15 years ago. She thought about standing in a courtroom, a young woman pleading guilty to a white-collar crime she did not commit, watching her father weep tears of relief in the gallery. She had traded her future for his freedom. When her father died, she thought the debt was settled. She thought the family owed her their lives. She had misunderstood the nature of sacrifice. When you show people you are willing to bleed for them, they do not see a savior. They see a blood bank. They were doing it again because she had taught them they could. She stopped walking. She was standing by the river. The water was dark and moving fast. She took a deep breath. The cold air filled her lungs, crisp and sharp. She reached into her pocket and felt the folded transfer slip. The original. The one she had taken from the archive. They didn't know she had it. They assumed it was still buried in the tax files, waiting for their internal auditors to find it. They thought she was the same girl she was 15 years ago. The silent protector. The willing martyr. They were wrong. Eleanor did not hire independent counsel. She did not panic. She went home to her townhouse, poured a single glass of red wine, and sat in the dark. She needed a plan. Not a defense, a demolition. The Sterling Family Trust was built on a very specific legal architecture. It was designed to protect the assets from external creditors, but it had a vulnerability. A failsafe built into the original charter by her grandfather, a paranoid man who trusted no one. It was a clause called the moral hazard provision. If any executive beneficiary was found to be deliberately defrauding the trust, their shares could be instantly liquidated and absorbed by the remaining untainted beneficiaries, provided there was irrefutable, documented proof presented to the independent trustees. But Julian had covered his tracks well. The paper trail pointed to her. To activate the provision against him, she needed more than his venture firm's failure. She needed proof that he had orchestrated the forgery, and she needed proof that her mother was complicit. The next evening, there was a charity gala at the City Museum. The Sterling family sponsored the main exhibit. Eleanor knew she was expected to attend. She knew they would expect her to look broken, anxious, or perhaps not show up at all. She wore a dark, tailored gown that looked like armor. She arrived exactly on time. The museum was a cavern of marble and echoing voices. Waiters carried trays of champagne. Eleanor walked into the main hall and immediately spotted her mother holding court near a display of Renaissance portraits. Margaret looked radiant, draped in diamonds that belonged to the trust. Julian was nearby, laughing loudly at a joke told by a local politician. Eleanor walked straight toward them. She did not avoid their eyes. Julian saw her first. His laugh died in his throat. Margaret turned, her smile stiffening slightly. "Eleanor," Margaret said, recovering quickly. "You came. I wasn't sure you would be up for it, given the stress at the office." "I am perfectly fine, Mother," Eleanor said, taking a glass of champagne from a passing tray. "In fact, I wanted to thank you." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Thank me for what?" "For giving me some time off. I've realized I've been working much too hard. I've decided to take a trip, a long one." Julian stepped closer. "Where are you going?" "I thought I might visit the Cayman Islands," Eleanor said smoothly. "I hear the banking sector there is fascinating this time of year." Julian's face went completely still. The color drained from his cheeks. Margaret's hand tightened around her evening bag. "That's a strange joke, Eleanor," Julian said, his voice dropping an octave. "Who's joking?" Eleanor smiled. She looked at her mother. "I have a lot of time on my hands now, and a lot of files I downloaded before the network locked me out. It's amazing what you find when you stop looking at the numbers and start looking at the IP addresses." She let the silence stretch. She watched the panic bloom in their eyes. She was not going to the Caymans. She had not downloaded the network files before the lockout. It was a bluff. But a guilty mind creates its own evidence. "Excuse me," Eleanor said, setting her untouched champagne on a table. "I need some air." She walked away, leaving them standing in the center of the room, surrounded by people, yet completely isolated in their fear. She went to the terrace. The night air was freezing. She waited. She knew how Julian operated under pressure. He didn't think. He reacted. 10 minutes later, the heavy glass door opened. Julian stepped out onto the terrace. He looked around to make sure they were alone. He walked over to her, his jaw tight. "What do you think you're doing, Eleanor?" he hissed. "I'm enjoying the gala," she said, looking out at the city lights. "You don't have any files. The system was wiped." "Was it?" Eleanor asked gently. "Did you wipe the shadow servers in the basement? The ones I installed 5 years ago for disaster recovery?" There were no shadow servers, but Julian didn't know that. He only knew marketing and public relations. He understood nothing of the physical architecture of their network. Julian grabbed her arm. His grip was surprisingly hard. "Listen to me," he said, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. "You're going to take this. You owe us. You ruined the family name 15 years ago." "I saved the family name 15 years ago," Eleanor corrected, pulling her arm out of his grasp. "Dad died in disgrace because of the stress you caused," Julian snapped. "You owe this family. The feds are coming for the venture capital firm. If they tie it to the main trust, we lose everything. We lose the estate, the holding company, the legacy. You don't have a life outside of this trust anyway. I am the face of this company. I am the future. You are just maintenance." Eleanor looked at her brother. She saw a terrified little boy hiding inside a bespoke suit. "So you forged my signature." "It had to be you," "It's believable," Julian said, his voice turning desperate, almost pleading. Mom agreed. "We talked about it for weeks. It's the only way to insulate the main assets. If you just plead ignorance, claim you were swindled by offshore brokers, they'll give you a light sentence. White-collar minimum security. We'll make sure you're comfortable. When you get out, your trust allowance will be tripled." He was offering her a bribe to go to prison. Eleanor felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. The last thread of familial loyalty, the invisible cord that had kept her tied to these people for 4 decades, finally snapped. It did not hurt. It felt like breathing for the first time. "Did Mom physically sign the board approval to unseal my signature file from the archives?" Eleanor asked. "Yes," Julian said impatiently. "She gave me the key to the vault. We are in this together, Eleanor. For the family." "For the family," Eleanor repeated softly. She reached into her clutch purse. She pressed a small button on the side of a silver tube that looked like a lipstick. A tiny red light blinked off. "Good night, Julian," she said. She walked back inside, leaving him alone in the cold. The audio recording was the first piece of the architecture, but it was not enough. Audio recordings were messy. They could be challenged in court. She needed the physical proof of the mechanics. She needed the key to the vault. The next day, Eleanor did not go to her office. She went to the city registry. She spent the morning pulling property deeds, not for the corporate holdings, but for the private estates. Then she visited a locksmith in a rough part of town, an old man who owed her a favor from her days managing the supply chain logistics. She paid him in cash for a specialized tool. That night, she drove to the family estate. Not the main house, but the guest cottage by the lake where her mother kept her private office. Eleanor knew her mother's schedule. Margaret played bridge on Thursday nights at the country club. The house staff left at 8. The estate was silent. Eleanor used her old key to enter the cottage. The air smelled of dried lavender and expensive paper. She walked to the heavy oak desk in the corner. She knew her mother kept the master keys in the locked bottom drawer. She used the tool the locksmith had given her. It took 3 minutes of patient manipulation before the lock clicked open. Inside the drawer was a velvet pouch. Inside the pouch was the brass key to the archive vault. But there was something else in the drawer. A leather-bound ledger. It looked incredibly old. Eleanor recognized it. It was her grandfather's private journal, the one everyone assumed was lost in a fire 20 years ago. Curiosity overrode her discipline. She opened the book. The pages were filled with her grandfather's sharp, cramped handwriting. She turned to the final entry, dated 3 days before he died. She read the words. And as she read, the floor beneath her seemed to vanish. Her grandfather had not trusted Julian. Even as a child, Julian had shown signs of cruelty, a willingness to lie to get what he wanted. Her grandfather had seen it, and he had protected the empire the only way he knew how. The journal detailed a secret addendum to the Master Trust Charter, a Shadow Proxy. Her grandfather had legally transferred 51% of the total voting shares of the entire Sterling Empire, not into the main trust, but into a blind, irrevocable proxy trust. And the sole beneficiary of that proxy trust, designated to inherit absolute control upon her 40th birthday, was Eleanor. Eleanor stared at the page. She was 44. She had owned the controlling stake of the company for 4 years without knowing it. The journal explained why. Eleanor has the spine for the burden, her grandfather wrote. Margaret will ruin the boy by protecting his weakness. Let them play with the titles. Let them have the offices. But when the time comes, Eleanor will own the earth beneath their feet. A note was clipped to the back of the page. It was in her mother's handwriting. It was dated 5 years ago. We cannot let her find out. If she knows she has the proxy, she will take the company from Julian. We must ensure she is legally disqualified from inheriting the Proxy shares. Eleanor closed the book. The air left her lungs. This was not about covering Julian's debts. The federal inquiry into Julian's venture firm was real, but the forgery, the setup, the framing of Eleanor, it was all a secondary mechanism. They weren't just making her the scapegoat to save the company. They were making her a convicted felon so that the morality clause in her grandfather's proxy trust would be triggered, legally stripping her of the controlling shares and defaulting them back to the main trust, controlled by Margaret and Julian. They had been planning this for years. They had watched her rebuild her life, watched her work in the shadows, watched her serve them, all while knowing she was the true owner of the empire. And they were going to put her in a cage to steal it from her. Eleanor touched her chest. She felt a profound, terrible calm settling over her. The wound of her past, the sacrifice she had made for her father, suddenly looked different. She realized she had not been protecting a family. She had been guarding a pack of wolves. She took the vault key. She took the journal. She locked the drawer and left the cottage exactly as she found it. On Friday morning, Eleanor requested a formal hearing before the independent trustees of the Sterling Family Trust. The trustees were 3 retired federal judges who oversaw the integrity of the charter. They agreed to meet at noon in the main boardroom. Julian and Margaret arrived together. Julian looked smug. Margaret looked serene. They believed this was Eleanor's formal surrender. They believed she was coming to beg for a favorable severance package before the internal auditors officially reported her to the authorities. Marcus Vance, the general counsel, sat at the end of the long mahogany table, looking deeply uncomfortable. The 3 trustees sat opposite Eleanor. "Eleanor," Judge Hastings, the senior trustee, began, "we understand you have called this meeting to address the financial irregularities discovered in your division. I must warn you, anything you say here is recorded and may be turned over to federal authorities." "I understand," Eleanor said. She placed her briefcase on the table. It made a solid, heavy sound. "I am here to invoke the moral hazard provision of the trust charter." Julian let out a short, sharp laugh. "You can't invoke that, Eleanor. You're the one under investigation." "I am invoking it," Eleanor continued, ignoring him. "Against Julian Sterling, CEO, and Margaret Sterling, chairwoman of the board." Margaret sighed, a theatrical sound of maternal disappointment. "Eleanor, please, stop this. It's humiliating." Eleanor opened her briefcase. She did not pull out a defense. She pulled out a demolition. She handed the first document to Judge Hastings. "This is the original transfer authorization slip for the $7.5 million, the one supposedly found by your internal auditors yesterday." "Yes," Hastings said, "bearing your signature." "If you look at the paper stock," Eleanor said calmly, "you will see a microscopic serial watermark in the lower left corner. The logistics division orders this paper in batches. The watermark on this slip proves it was manufactured and delivered to this building 3 weeks ago." She handed over a second document. "This is a sworn affidavit from the manager of the archives. He confirms that I have not requested physical access to the secure vault in 6 months. However, the access logs, which I have also provided, show the vault was opened twice last month, by a master key." Julian leaned forward. "So someone stole a master key. It proves nothing." "It proves," Eleanor said, pressing a button on her phone and setting it on the table, "that you and Mother coordinated the forgery." The recording from the museum terrace played. The audio was crystal clear in the quiet boardroom. Julian's voice echoed off the wood paneling. "It had to be you. It's believable. Mom agreed. We talked about it for weeks. She gave me the key to the vault." The color drained from Julian's face. He looked at Marcus Vance. But the lawyer was staring at the table, refusing to make eye contact. Margaret stood up. "This is an illegal recording. It is inadmissible. She manipulated him into saying those things." "This is not a court of law, Mother," Eleanor said coldly. "This is a trust hearing. The trustees have broad discretion regarding the admissibility of evidence. But if you prefer physical proof..." Eleanor reached into the briefcase one last time. She pulled out the leather-bound journal. Margaret gasped. It was a sharp, involuntary intake of air. She reached out to grab the table to steady herself. "This is the private journal of Arthur Sterling," Eleanor said, handing it to the judges. "In it, you will find a handwritten confession by my mother, detailing a conspiracy to defraud the rightful owner of the Shadow Proxy Trust." Judge Hastings opened the journal. He read the marked page. The silence in the room became absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a collapsing structure. A proxy trust? Julian looked bewildered. He looked at his mother. "What proxy trust? What is she talking about?" Margaret didn't look at him. She stared at Eleanor with pure, unfiltered hatred. The mask of the loving mother was gone. There was only a cold, cornered animal left. 51% of the voting shares, Judge Hastings read aloud, his voice grave. "Vested in Eleanor Sterling upon her 40th birthday." He looked up, his eyes wide. "Eleanor, you have held majority control of this entire corporation for 4 years." "They knew," Eleanor said. "They needed me convicted of a felony to trigger the morality clause and strip me of the proxy. They weren't just framing me to save the company. They were framing me to steal my inheritance." Julian fell back into his chair. "Mom?" he whispered. "Is that true?" Margaret said nothing. "The evidence of gross moral hazard, fiduciary fraud, and conspiracy against a primary beneficiary is irrefutable," Eleanor said, looking directly at the 3 judges. "I demand the immediate liquidation of Julian and Margaret Sterling's beneficiary status. I demand their removal from the board. And I am asserting my right as majority shareholder to restructure the holding company." Judge Hastings looked at the other 2 trustees. They nodded slowly. The evidence was overwhelming. It was not a battle. It was an execution. "We will need an hour to formalize the paperwork," Hastings said quietly. "But pending legal review, the motion is granted." Julian started to shake. "Eleanor, you can't do this. The venture firm debts. If I lose my trust allowance, I'm bankrupt. I'll go to prison." Eleanor looked at the brother she had once tried to protect. "Then you will learn how to survive it. I did." She stood up, closing her empty briefcase. She looked at her mother. Margaret's face was pale, her hands trembling slightly on the table. "You are just like your grandfather," Margaret hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "Cold, ruthless. You will be completely alone." "I was always alone, Mother," Eleanor said softly. "I just finally realized it." Eleanor walked out of the boardroom. The air in the hallway felt lighter. The carpets did not look like deep water anymore. They looked like a path forward. The transition took 3 weeks. It was brutal and public. When the trustees filed the paperwork to dissolve Julian and Margaret's shares, the financial markets panicked. The federal regulators moved in, dissecting Julian's venture firm. Without the protection of the Sterling family money, Julian was indicted within the month. Margaret was forced to vacate the main estate, moving into a small condominium across the city, her reputation ruined among the social elite she had ruled for decades. Eleanor did not attend Julian's arraignment. She did not visit her mother. She took over the CEO office on the top floor of the Sterling building. She had the heavy mahogany furniture removed and replaced with clean, modern glass and steel. She wanted nothing that smelled of the past. 6 months later, on a quiet Tuesday evening, Eleanor was the last person in the building. She sat at her new desk, overlooking the city skyline. The lights glittered in the cold night air. She opened a file drawer. Inside, perfectly aligned, was a single cream-colored transfer authorization slip with a forged signature. She kept it not as a reminder of the betrayal, but as a reminder of the mechanism. She kept it to remind herself that power was not in the title or the money or the name on the door. Power was the patience to let those who seek to destroy you build their own gallows. The office smelled faintly of the rain hitting the glass outside. She ran her fingers over the smooth edge of the desk. She did not smile, but the tension that had lived in her shoulders for 15 years was entirely gone. She closed the drawer. The quiet click echoed in the empty room. This has been a work of fiction, created for entertainment purposes. Names, characters, businesses, places, and incidents are products of imagination and do not represent any real persons or events.